But is Cape independence necessary? Well, Cape independence supporters are often accused of having a lager mentality. And if anybody accuses me of having a lager mentality, they're absolutely correct. I do, and so should you. A lager is a highly successful strategy through which vulnerable groups of people operating in hostile territory where they're greatly outnumbered organize themselves to defend everything they hold most dear from destruction. And this is exactly the situation with ideological minorities in South Africa find themselves in today. Because South Africa is divided into two camps. The largest and politically dominant group is the African nationalists. The African nationalists at best pay lip service to the concept of non-racialism, and at worst, they reject it outright. They support race-based policy, the centralization of power in the state. They're inherently hostile towards business and intent on weakening or removing property rights. On their agenda is expropriation without compensation, privatizing the Reserve Bank, the destruction of the private health service, and an increased role for state-owned enterprises. Extreme elements are literally threatening genocide. Their global outlook is eastward and not west. And we mustn't fool ourselves into thinking that this is some fringe group and that the South African populace is somehow benign. If we're to understand the scale of the threat that African nationalists truly pose, we must not just look at South African election results as a whole, but instead we need to remove the Western Cape, which is the only province where African nationalists do not hold sway, and to examine what then remains. And in 2019, 73.1% of voters outside of the Western Cape voted either ANC or EFF, whilst only 16% voted DA, and most of those votes were cast in areas where ethnic minorities are highly concentrated. And it's also critical to recognise that African nationalists are not becoming more moderate. They are becoming more radical. And in 2021, in our polling, we asked Western Cape voters this question: do you believe that South Africa belongs equally to everyone, regardless of their race? Or do you believe it belongs primarily to Africans and other races should behave as guests? And in 2021, 45% of black voters in the Western Cape said that other races should behave as guests. When we asked that same question in 2023, 2 years later, the number had increased from 45% to 69%, with only 31% of black voters in the Western Cape believing in the concept of non-racialism. And the dream scenario for African nationalists is exactly the one which is likely to unfold in the 2024 elections. That the ANC cannot form a government on its own, but instead its hold on political power becomes dependent upon its more radical allies. And that should terrify us. Why? Because almost everybody in this room belongs to the other camp. There's everything to lose when a more radical version of the African nationalists inevitably comes to power. Our camp believes in genuine non-racialism. That South Africa really does belong equally to everyone, regardless of their race. That property rights are an essential element of a vibrant economy, and that economic success is the only viable foundation for a prosperous future for all. We believe that the state should have limited capacity, that power should be decentralized, and that free markets can address most of our challenges. And our global outlook is westward and not east. We currently hold one province, where for now we form an ideological majority. But for how long will that remain true? And we must not blind ourselves to the reality of our situation. A toxic mix of economic desperation, the breakdown of family values, and illegal land invasions on a vast scale means that our ideological hegemony in the Western Cape will at best last another 10 years. And this is a point which Cape Town Mayor Jordan Hill Lewis readily conceded to me when he said, "Phil, in 10 years' time, you might have been right and I might have been wrong." Because the trouble is that in 10 years' time, it'll all be too late. So it may be an uncomfortable truth, but if we as non-racialists and capitalists want to have a home at Africa's southern tip, then we need to create an ideological homeland for ourselves which we can control before the opportunity is lost forever. And we don't need to imagine what the alternative will be, because Zimbabwe stands in living testimony of what our future will look like without it. So is Cape independence necessary? Well, if you want to keep on living the life that you currently live, and if you want a future for your children on the African continent, then it's time to circle the wagons, because Cape independence is quite literally essential to our survival.